Yes, it is my honor today to introduce Paul Warmbier. I've known Paul for 7 or 8 years now. We met while we were living in Moscow, Idaho. Paul was doing his MFA from the U of I. Paul lives in McMinnville, and he is a teacher at Dayton High School. He lives in McMinnville with his wife, Abby, and their 2 kids. Paul is a veteran, and we're going to hear his story a little bit today. He's a published author with his book Geometry of Fire officially came out on the 1st. So really excited to hear a little bit more about Paul's new book. And yeah, so Paul, welcome to the club, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Daniel. I really appreciate it. And thanks for thinking of me and giving me your time. It is much appreciated. So just came out August 1st, my debut memoir, Geometry of Fire. And before I talk about it, do any readings or anything, I wanted to remember, Charlie, those inspirational pieces, especially Oscar Wilde and A.A. Milne, were really poignant and well chosen, I think. A lot of my work revolves around an existentialist philosophy of understanding responsibility for our own actions and then living our lives, creating meaning accordingly. So Oscar Wilde, thinking about being alone being the only way or a way to create an understanding of ourselves, I think is really important. And as we live this bizarre life right now for an indeterminate amount of time, potentially more alone than normal, I think that's a good perspective to have on things. And of course, A.A. Milne, Winnie the Pooh is one of the best versions of an authentic person who takes, or character who takes responsibility, who is a good friend, good character. And it's always great to see those, hear those. So I wanted to talk just really briefly. I know I have limited time, and as a teacher, I am extremely long-winded and love talking, love hearing my own voice according to what my students tell me. So naturally, I wanted to be a writer so I could impress myself upon other people where they can't avoid me or my voice. So when I was 17, I enlisted in the Marine Corps. It's a very similar story to a lot of people from many generations. And during that time, this was in 2002, 2003, as soon as I graduated high school, I joined the Marine Corps, went into the infantry. Short weeks after infantry school, I was deployed to the Middle East. I was in 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. We were one of the first units to go in after the invasion of Iraq. And we were stationed in a very centralized location within Al-Anbar province. And being just 18 years old, a lot of what we were doing, a lot of our goals and aims, and the aims of the Marine Corps in general were not really something that I thought of or considered or participated in any way other than a passive sense of, at most, like, oh, maybe someday I'll understand what's going on here. Flash forward a couple of years, I'm out of the military, and like many people who leave the military to go on to do better things, college, families, what have you, I was lost, utterly, completely lost in what I was, what I wanted to be, and not recognizing the trauma that I had experienced in the infantry. I was part of the first big Fallujah operation. I was part of a push through Ramadi. We were part of a second deployment where we stayed in Fallujah. We had been in really hard hit areas, and that was such a whirlwind. I didn't really recognize what was going on until years later. And my wife came to the understanding, helped me come to the understanding. Funny that we were talking about at the very beginning of this meeting, what is okay? Like, are you okay? No, things were not okay. And this book is an attempt to try and do two things. Recognize the need for people with trauma, not just veterans, but people who have experienced trauma, which I think is the vast majority of people on Earth. Have them recognize the need for therapy, because therapy was something that ultimately changed my life and saved my life, but also destigmatize what it means to be traumatized. And trauma is different for every person, right? We have to create our own meaning and understandings of what trauma is to us. And so when I started my MFA in creative nonfiction, I'm an essayist, as well as writing a book, I really wanted to explore these deeper understandings of how I created meaning out of the chaos of my life at that time and of my mind. And I teach in a school now where a lot of my students are deeply traumatized. And I find myself playing counselor a lot. I find myself walking kids away from suicide, walking kids away from harming themselves, being in really hard situations. And that's a very prevalent problem. I mean, it's not just all my hard-hit community. And as I have been writing this over the past 8-10 years, it's really changed and morphed into, how can I get the most amount of people possible to read something to where I bear myself utterly and recognize to myself and to others my problems, with an aim to how do we help ourselves. And this is not a self-help book, but an aim to really change, have us recognize the need for help, reaching out for help. And so poignant, we're 5 months in a time where we're all going to need therapy at some level after COVID. And before I want to read a few small sections of this, and I'm making sure to time myself, so I give myself time for this. But right before I read, not just did I want to extend my experience to people, I wanted to have us, those who read my book, see that part of recognizing trauma, war trauma, moral trauma, is an effort it needs to be an effort at taking responsibility. So let me read, if you guys don't mind. I timed out small sections of this, but to begin with, I wanted to read there's two epigrams at the very front of this book. One by Eric Maria Remarque, who wrote All Quiet on the Western Front, which is kind of like the seminal anti-war book from World War I. And then one from Jean-Paul Sartre, existentialist philosopher. So Remarque wrote, "I want to feel that I belong here. I want to hearken and know when I go back to the front line that the war will sink down, be drowned utterly in the great homecoming tide. Know that it will then be past forever and not gnaw us continually, that we'll have none but an outward power over us." He had this hope that somehow trauma would not gnaw at us. But if you have experienced trauma, you know that it gnaws, and it's always keeping the wolves at bay. And then Sartre wrote a very famous quote, "That is what I mean when I say that man is condemned to be free, condemned because he did not create himself, yet is nevertheless at liberty, and from the moment that he is thrown into this world, he is responsible for everything that he does." So let me read I found 3 very small sections that kind of jump through the book so you get a better picture. This is from the first essay called Added Weight. 3 bullets ricocheted off an engine block. The car refused to stop, we said. We pleaded to commanders, locals, ourselves. 3 bullets, a recipe to stop a vehicle. 2 shot off to the sun, leaving behind molecules of sparked iron and gasoline. The 3rd ripped the kid's carotid artery to silky ribbons that fluttered momentarily like prayer flags, high on a mountain, sending thoughts and penitence off to the unknown. He couldn't have been more than 14. Another death among many. He lay there, stinking of sweat and shit and American intervention. 2 of us sat up late that night, alone in the cold air, listening to cars beyond the wire and the trash burn pit crackle as bags and batteries were thrown into the flames to rain down on us in black soot. A sister squad of Marines lugged their vests and guns to the shadows to the staging area for a night ambush. Their scent sour, unwashed, apathy wafting over the cloud of burn pit ash. Why did it happen? He repeated on a shaky loop like the end of a record as we sat listening to the night. It's war, is all I could think of. The textbook explanations were hollow and meaningless. They were true, but withdrew none of the weight that was building and the burden that would never leave. The standard responses rarely are good enough. We sat, we talked, recounting what happened over and over. I listened. How could I help? This was not my first fight, not his, not the first stray bullet, not the last. With each one, it all burrowed deeper into the soul, harder to scrub away. It became us as our DNA replicated with a new mutation, now being encoded, now continuous, now the norm. It added a weight and indiscernible burden that eased with time, but never fully peeled away. Before I have 2 other short readings in my time with you, but I really want to, I started writing as a way to make sure I did not lose my memories. It's one of my biggest fears. My grandpa was a veteran of the Korean War, wounded multiple times, awarded for bravery. And he never spoke about anything during his entire life, except for once that I know of with me after my first deployment. He's passed. My grandma just turned 90, and my mom and dad brought a book to her, my book. And she told me, you know, I wish that she read it in like one sitting. And she told me that she wishes she had had this idea before, because, you know, at that time he was told after Korea, dropped off the boat, you're back home, forget what happened. Just forget what happened, move on with your life. Well, with PTSD, that doesn't work. They didn't really know that back then, or they didn't accept it. He lost a lot of his memories over time due to various brain damages that happened when he was deployed. And when he talked to me, he shared with me how hard it was for him to go through that and deal with that, and how terrified he was that I would do the same thing. And so I started writing this book with that aim initially of, I got to get my stuff down before it's gone. I've got PTSD, I've got TBI. My memories are harder and harder to scratch together sometimes. And as I was writing it, that first bit was a standalone essay that was published elsewhere 2 years ago or something. And that was like one of the first things about my time that I wrote, and has always stuck with me. And I'm glad that I got it down, because a lot of those memories could easily go away. So I'll read a second section This is that memoir piece where I'm focusing not just on recollections, but a thematic understanding of myself. So this is a start. I once heard that to get a fresh start in life, one must go very far and never come back home. By the summer of 2003, I not only was ready to run away from the small town I was raised in, but I knew that if I did not leave forever, I would not leave at all. That's the kind of town Salmon, Idaho was. When you left for good, or like swimming through a vortex, no strength of volition would ever allow change. It took me many years to get to that point. My life began in the privilege that small town kids of middle class families all had, namely an expectation of college, success, a job, home ownership, and happiness. I was born late 1985 while the crickets crackled their mating displays to one another in a length of never-ending radio static. Whitefish, Montana had not yet reached its boom point as a haven for skiers, and the dual parish Lutheran churches my father ministered to allowed us to live in nearby Columbia Falls. It was a mill town on the tracks of the Great Northern Railway whose freight and passenger cars rumbled through the Mission Mountains. Columbia Falls was always seemed to be trying to decide whether it preferred mill, locomotive, or cigarette smoke. Mostly it was all three. In the mid to late 80s, loggers and Glacier Park cowboys patrolled the numerous bars at night, red flannels with perpetually rolled sleeves, thin and see-through with age, and weeks in the saddle and under the sun, and tin cloth pants, and stained Stetsons slowly breaking down like iron coated in rust. Always hopelessly torn and stained, provided the town with a classic Montana cliche. It seemed to be gone these days, for better or worse. Growing up in small towns, it was always an expectation of me that there would be military time or some kind of service time. And I talk about that a lot because that drove a lot of my decisions early on. But what it didn't allow me to do was drive therapy as a notion when I began to understand my trauma. So when I broke through that was an important moment for me. Because I am running low on time, I will skip to the very last section, another small piece, and then I will close up. This is a piece on therapy. It's easy to understand that things are going to take a while to become evident when they begin to change. But knowing the change is going to happen and being patient for the change are two very different matters entirely. Hello again, Paul, my therapist said. I'm glad you made it today. I know that the weather has not really been cooperating with us, so I'm glad that you made the drive. She said this while staring into my face fiercely, a kind of smile breaking the intensity in her eyes. A few months into the program, the therapist suggested things were not getting any easier. The revelations and existential angst kept me up at night, but it also kept me reading. I began reading Kierkegaard and Sartre, Husserl and Marcel. I could label what was going on as an understanding of purpose and meaning, an attempt to live my life in an authentic manner. I had a friend, rather than the therapist, teach me the philosophy behind phenomena and meaning, and somehow it made more sense. Over glasses of wine at a restaurant he managed, the waiter/professor talked to me about what it meant to live authentically and how to change our approach to life so we could do such. The necessity to understand had never been stronger. Through the weeks of sessions, I became a master of my emotional responses and triggers, that is, when I remembered to be. Not only was it easier to recognize them in myself, but as I talked, it became easier to identify where things came from. It was hard to believe that this was actually working, if only to make myself more aware of the differing ways to solve a problem that I created in my daily life. It became easier to pinpoint individual nightmares. I knew, for example, that when I dreamed about dripping blood or missing people, I could look back while using my new dream journal and find a connection to the IED in 2005. So when I thought about the IED in 2005, I could understand a bit more about what it did to me at the moment. She gave me homework. I took a dozen worksheets with me each week. The instructions told me to write down feelings and emotions related to interactions throughout the day. I was supposed to analyze better reactions to those emotions, which often drove me to understand behavior. One day's interactions sound something like this, and because I am short on time, I will leave that up to you. This is, so thank you very much. Daniel, thanks for thinking of me, and everyone giving me the time to do this, to speak to you all. This is a really important mission for me, not just within the veteran community to try and get more people to understand, but the need for all of us to understand our traumas and work through them within ourselves. So thank you very much, everybody.
Wow, thank you, Paul. So we do have some time for questions. So if anybody would like to ask Paul a question, and you'll just need to unmute yourself and jump in.
Yeah, Paul, I'm interested in, you joined right out of high school, I guess at 18. You said you were driven by sort of the conditions in the small town, service. Your grandfather, your father served too?
No, my father never did. He's a pastor, but pretty much everybody else in my family were either military or police.
Yeah. So within then, I mean, it sounds like you're within, you have been taught serve not only your country, but serve others. So that continues still. What are you doing now to satisfy that now that you're out of the military?
I'm a high school teacher. I
there you go.
barely make money in order, and I serve because of that.
There you go.
But I worked for a number of years. I don't know if you're familiar with Team Rubicon at all. A good friend of mine founded Team Rubicon with another friend, and I was lucky enough to work with them for a number of years doing disaster relief. And working with veterans to try and find purpose in life when their major purpose of military was over. I used to own and manage a winery up until a couple of years ago, where we worked with veterans to try and bring them into the vineyards to find more of that purpose in horticulture, in creation rather than destruction. But now it's just teaching.
Yeah, thanks. And just as an aside, I was in the military too. I served in Vietnam for a year. After the military, I had this need to help veterans and myself try to understand what we did. And I think that's probably that's a common thread, I think, between the two of us, is that helping others really helps yourself as well. You know what I mean? Helping the other veterans. This was at Ohio State in Columbus, Ohio. And we opened up a counseling center that really, there was a couple of Air Force bases close by, Wright Pat and Dayton, and just helping veterans, not only that have been in the war, but even the conscientious objectors, even the people that didn't want to be in the war, that were traumatized by what was going on. This is back in the 70s, 60s and 70s. So that's a common thread. I think you're really right on in terms of the work that you've done here and your book.
Thank you, Jerry, and thank you for your service. I appreciate. And I think that you're right. We have this kind of inborn need to give. I think everybody does, but people who have that feeling of duty to the either military or service of some kind, AmeriCorps, Peace Corps, what have you. But after the military, I think a lot of people they want to take some time to create instead of destroy. And one of the best things that we can do to create is help creation of meaning in others.
Yeah, thanks. And unlearn.
Yeah, and we unlearn together. Like doing this alone, this is, I think, one big reason why we have such high veteran suicide rates here. is because we have this individualized sense of like, I'm tough, I can do it. Well, that's all fine and good until you can't.
Yep.
All right.
I want to ask if you can put your contact information to order the book directly from you into the chat. I know that we
Oh,
can get
absolutely.
it online at Amazon, but would love to support you and your endeavors in this. And then also, I do have a question around, there's been, of course, a lot of talk about policing and national service, the use of federal forces up in Portland. I know this is kind of a big box to open here, but can you just share a little bit of your thoughts on what it means to be, a veteran and be part of that community at this time?
I have become a pacifist in the past years. And I look at my military years as a very important kind of catalyst time for me to understand that. And because I wrote this book and because I've come to the understanding that I am attempting to take responsibility for what we did, I am trying to do that in all facets of my life, whether it is recognizing my own inborn privilege of being a white cis male, or whether it is in the privilege given to me via the responsibility I'm expected to take as a veteran, as a community leader in my community, as, the skills that I learned in the military are very helpful for all of that. But what it's really given me is the chance and the opportunity to really think through deeply what we see going on in the world and how we can change it. And, that's going to look different for everybody, I think. But for me, writing this book, thinking about societal issues, I am less likely to just jump on things like I used to, and think through how are we providing love and care and justice for those communities who need it the most. And my time really gave me the I think, experiences in order to do that better. Anyways, I'm certainly not perfect at it.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question or if that's too oblique, Daniel.
That's perfect. Thank you, Paul. I'll follow up tomorrow when we're up there.
Yeah. So Paul, thank you so much for giving your time to us today. Just some really important words. I'm so appreciative that you are a high school teacher. So I think the work that you're doing is incredibly valuable for our young people that are, coming forward to be our next leaders. So, thank you for what you do, and also for, sharing your words with us and your experience. And we'll look forward to putting the purchase information into our chat group so that we can, support your work and your voice and share it.